Here's something you don't see every day. The sitting Attorney General of the United States, which is one of the most nonpartisan offices that is supposed to exist in the entire government, name-checking the political opposition to the president and saying there's no evidence that Donald Trump is shredding institutions, but really it's the resistance.
I think it's important that we not, in this period of intense partisan feeling, destroy our institutions. I think one of the ironies today is that people are saying that it's President Trump that's shredding our institutions. I really see no evidence of that. And from my perspective, the idea of resisting a democratically elected president and basically throwing everything at him and really changing the norms on the grounds that we have to stop this president. That's where the shredding of our norms and our institutions is occurring.
I'm joined by Senator Richard Blumenthal from the Judiciary Committee, a former federal prosecutor. You take these issues seriously, and I don't make light of them, but I am compelled to say, at the end of this week, with Mueller breaking his silence, Attorney General Bill Barr's argument boils down to, I know you are, but what am I? I mean, what is he doing, talking about the resistance shredding institutions? And how would citizens shred institutions? They're not in charge of the Justice Department.
You know, what William Barr is doing to the Department of Justice and to the rule of law is so disgraceful and shameful. All you have to do is go over what Donald Trump has said about the Department of Justice, about the brave and dedicated men and women of the FBI, about judges, Obama judges, and about the rule of law in this country. And clearly it is he, Donald Trump, the President of the United States, who is shredding those institutions. Nicole Wallace did a wonderful segment which showed Trump's statements over a period of time. And for William Barr to blame anyone but the President of the United States for undermining the credibility of those institutions, particularly...
Is it even appropriate, Senator, for him to be holding forth his random opinions about the propriety of the resistance? I mean, why would the Attorney General do that at all? I get, by the way, the campaign folks doing that. They have every right, that we're going to have a big, boisterous debate in the country. But is that really where the AG should be?
He is very cleverly and deceptively using the power of TV. We saw it with Bob Mueller. In 9 minutes, he did more to move the needle than weeks, maybe years of commentary.
You mentioned that. I've heard this a lot, that I've heard from people in Washington that Barr understands Trump's obsessions, and so he has been leaning into them. No collusion talking points, things that can be tweeted, and then, of course, television. Did it strike you that in this new interview, he's in this sort of cabin environment with the fire over the corner and the vest? Do you read into that at all?
I read into that very ingenious use of demeanor, style, background, obviously the fire roaring, the vest, the informality, all designed to create an impression.
So, which, by the way, we have expected from our presidents and our politicians. You're a politician as well as a senator, right? You have a government job and you're a politician. But to see the Attorney General, I mean, there's something concerning there, even though I'm not suggesting it's as serious as the other things. But it's certainly different than many other attorneys general. And the other thing I want to push you on, though, is your party. You mentioned Nicole Wallace, our great colleague who's done great breakdowns. Jimmy Kimmel, of all people, who happens to be a comedian, but a very clear speaker. And he put your speaker to task on this. Take a look.
Well, we've been on that path for a while. And when we do get to where we're going to be ready.
But it feels like we've been on the path for a really, really long while.
We really have, well...
Like since the 70s.
It has to be clear to the American people, and we have to hope that it will be clear to the Republicans in this United States Senate.
And you think that those Republican senators, even if they know he committed a crime, will side with Donald Trump?
They have been every day, and not one of them has spoken up.
Does he have a point about pressing her to start an impeachment probe?
He has a very, very good point about the impatience of the American people with the criminality of the president, which is depicted.
Now I have to ask you, was that a yes?
Here's where I agree with Speaker Pelosi and with my Democratic colleagues who are demanding an impeachment inquiry, as they call it right now. We need accountability. That ought to be our guiding principle, whether it is in the Congress through an impeachment proceeding or in the courts or in the court of public opinion at the ballot box. But what's really important here is that we know what we have in common, which is there have to be hearings. And it comes back to the power of television. The word from Bob Mueller's mouth will continue to move the needle. You know, I've been out in the state of Connecticut for these past several days at 9 parades or more, ceremonies, all kinds of meetings with constituents, and clearly opinions are evolving and changing.
Right.
That's the power of
which is a fascinating
television.
part of this, and now in the week that Mueller has spoken. Hey, I'm Ari Melber from MSNBC. You can see more of our videos right here, or better yet, subscribe to our YouTube channel below. You could have been anywhere in the world, but you're here with us, and we appreciate that.